May 7th, 2017 was the big day. The Ohio State University graduation ceremony was in full swing. But when the name Reagan Tess was called out, Reagan wasn't there, and a small group of people walked up to accept her degree in tears. The group was Reagan's family. They were on their way to accept her degree on her behalf, as she wasn't there to accept it herself. But that's because Reagan had been found brutally murdered in a park just a few months before that big day. She'd been looking forward to graduation. But now, instead of beaming up at her parents from the stage in her graduation gown, waving at the camera and shaking hands with the alumni, Reagan was buried in the ground, and her family was left with nothing. Nothing but unimaginable pain. Welcome to True Crime Stories. I'm your host, Ty Knutz. And if you love old-fashioned true crime without a bunch of AI garbage, you've come to the right place because that's basically all we do here. True crime and no drama. So if that's your thing, be sure to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future cases. Reagan Delaney Tess was born on March 13, 1995 in Edgewood, Kentucky. She attended Anthony Wayne High School where she participated in lacrosse and tennis. Reagan was raised as a Christian and she was defined as a vibrant, energetic, athletic, and very caring young girl. She was also smart as a whip. She graduated from high school with honors and went on to enroll in Ohio State University to study psychology. When she got into college, the Tokes family moved to Parkland, Florida, where her parents both got jobs. But Reagan decided to stay behind to finish up her degree at Ohio State, which is actually her dream university. Her mom defined Reagan as a ball of energy. But she was incredibly warm, and like many of us, had a particularly soft spot for animals. Well, at the time of today's case, Reagan was a senior getting ready for graduation. In fact, she already had her first major job lined up, and she was just a few short months away from starting her life as an adult. At the time, Reagan was living in an off-campus housing with 4 different roommates. It was near campus, so she easily went to and from her classes to her home in no time. She was also working part-time at a local restaurant to pay her tuition. But unfortunately, not everything was a cakewalk for Reagan. Even though everything else in her life was bright and promising, the same couldn't be said about her personal life. See, Reagan had been in a relationship with a guy named Jacob, better known as Jake. And the two had known each other for a very long time, several years. To everyone else on the outside, Reagan and Jake were meant to be. They were each other's best friends, but since both of them were in their senior year, they decided to prioritize their studies. And in the end, they called it quits. But it was easier said than done. And even though Reagan tried to keep herself busy, it was evident to her friends, family, and even roommates that the breakup was anything but easy on her. Reagan tried not to let her emotions get the best of her, so she kept herself busy and even talked to Jake often, but only as friends. This was an incredibly difficult time for her, but she refused to let her emotions show, at least as much as she could. She had a lot to look forward to, but her life was very different now without Jacob. But either way, she buckled down, pulled herself together, and marched towards her inevitable graduation ceremony. Reagan was just 2 months away from getting her diploma. But until then, she had to keep up the grind, going to work every day, studying after class, getting ready for finals, all the typical stuff. But this brings us all the way to February of 2017 when Reagan put on her daily uniform and headed off to work on a chilly afternoon. But the only problem was this particular day would be unlike any other that Reagan had ever seen. Because after her shift at work, Reagan never came home. Reagan worked at Bodega, a bar and restaurant in downtown Columbus. Her shift started early in the evening. Soon, February 8th, 2017, just months away from graduation, she got ready and left their apartment. As she got done with her shift, she left the restaurant and drove home in her 1999 silver Acura. This was around 9:45 p.m. Now, even though Reagan was pretty familiar with the place, her parents still worried for her because they were literally 1,000 miles away from each other. So, to put her parents at ease, Reagan kept them updated via texts. But on this fateful day, Reagan's family didn't receive any texts or calls from her. Now, this was really odd because up until an hour or 2 ago, Reagan was actively texting her dad, updating him on miscellaneous things in her life. Reagan's sister and dad blew up her phone, but she would never pick up again. Up until the next day, no one heard a peep from Reagan, and this was when panic settled in, and they decided to reach out to Reagan's roommates. But imagine their surprise when the rest of the girls hadn't heard from Reagan either. On top of that, Reagan wasn't even at home. Her bedroom was empty and her bag was still there, so she didn't go to class. Again, this was incredibly unusual. Their final stop was the restaurant where Reagan worked, Bodega. And there, the manager confirmed Reagan was present at her shift, and she left without any problem. With all that done, the girls updated Reagan's parents on the situation, and this is what ultimately led to 21-year-old Reagan Tokes being reported missing. Reagan's roommates began to spread the word about their disappearance on social media. Everyone was on edge and worried for Reagan. Where could she have gone? And most importantly, what had happened? Well, it was a day after Reagan's disappearance that 911 received a very distressed call. The call was made from a man working in Coto Grove Metro Park. His stroll was about to take a traumatizing turn, though. As he reached a vast field in the park, in the distance, he saw something. It's become kind of a running theme at this point, but naturally at first the guy thought that maybe he was seeing a mannequin, but say it with me, it's never a mannequin. As soon as the man realized what he was looking at, he called 911 and begged them to come to the scene of an apparent crime. The detectives almost immediately arrived at the scene, and sure enough, it was the disrobed body of a deceased woman with 2 wounds to the head. She'd been attacked with a firearm at point-blank range, and she was cold to the touch. The police had a very bad feeling about this. They knew that 21-year-old Reagan was just reported missing, and now they'd found the body of a woman. But to be sure, they needed to ID this body as soon as possible. Well, that didn't take long because the woman was wearing a very unique necklace, and she also had a tattoo of a circle on her body. The detectives called in one of Raven's relatives, her uncle, because he lived nearby, and he was unfortunately the one to identify her body. It was such a heartbreaking and devastating moment for Reagan's uncle because he took one look at the body and knew without a doubt this was his niece. But the worst part was the police still needed to call her parents and break the news. This was not the update anyone had been hoping for, but unfortunately it was reality. Reagan Tokes was gone. Reagan's disappearance was now a full-blown murder investigation, and the detectives had various theories. It could have been a random attack. It could have been someone who knew Reagan and wanted her dead, or it could be the doing of a serial killer. There were multiple theories in the opening stages of this investigation. All of this would be ironed out soon enough, but in theme time, an autopsy was carried out and the findings were harrowing. Not only was Reagan's life taken in an execution-style manner, but the murderer had also taken advantage of her beforehand. This news in particular is one of the hardest things for Reagan's family to come to terms with. It was bad enough to hear that their daughter had her life stolen away from her, but like this was too much. Initially, the police had very little evidence, but they were trying to find clues to connect Reagan's attack to several different robberies and attacks in the Columbus area at the time. There were multiple reports of people getting overpowered and attacked from behind, and the assailants would then rob the victims. This happened in a lot of dimly lit areas and streets in the city. And it didn't come as a surprise that the street behind Bodega, where Reagan and the rest of the part-time workers parked their cars, was very dark and dangerous. While the investigators were looking into this, they also decided to question people closest to Reagan. One of those people was none other than Reagan's ex-boyfriend, Jake. The detectives were suspicious of Jake because he and Reagan had just broken up and Reagan was pretty upset and depressed about it. So naturally, Jake immediately became a person of interest. So, he was called into the station, and after he was grilled with question after question, well, he had a rock-a-lit alibi for the night that Reagan went missing, and he was also very worried for her. Even Reagan's roommates came to defend Jake, saying that there was no way he could have done something like this. I mean, sure, the breakup was hard, but it was hard for both of them. And now Jake was crestfallen at the bright, bubbly, and beautiful woman that he fell in love with and shared so much time with, and Dari now being gone. Well, sometime later, the investigators let Jake go because they couldn't find anything fishy about the guy or his behavior. So they were back to square one. What's interesting is that at this point, Reagan's car was still missing, and the police still needed to find it. They thought that there'd be some kind of evidence in it that could help the investigators solve this case, which was causing unrest among the people in the community. So, the investigators doubled down and used license plate tracking to figure out where Reagan's car would be. And sure enough, their efforts came through. Reagan's car was found. It was abandoned on the side of a road on A Street not too far from where Reagan's body was found on Oakwood Avenue in southeast Columbus. This was huge progress in the case because once the detectives looked inside the car, there were a lot of things that really piqued their interest. First, it looked like someone tried to set the car ablaze. But obviously, unfortunately, it didn't work. There were cigarette butts on the front seats of the car, as well as a red gas can inside the car. But speaking of inside, the car was a mess. There were receipts littered all over the car seats, but this was nothing but a clearly labeled trail of evidence for the police. This was incredible news both for the cops and Reagan's family, because there was a good chance these receipts would lead them straight to her killer. So the investigators took all of these things and sent the cigarette butts and car for DNA testing, while they honed in on the receipts and theme in time. But these weren't just store receipts, though. They were bank receipts. ATM transaction receipts, to be exact. And when the police went through this handful of receipts, it seemed as though someone tried to use Reagan's ATM card to withdraw money, and a lot of it. It seemed that the person tried to withdraw hundreds of dollars, but obviously it didn't work. In the end, the person only managed to withdraw 60, so the investigators finally had a lead. They just needed to go to the same ATM from which these transactions were made, and they would get their answers either via CCTV, fingerprints, or plethora of other methods. So to the bank the detectives went. And when they checked the CCTV footage, they were shocked. They were expecting a robber making a transaction with Reagan's cards. But when they viewed the footage, it was Reagan who was making the transaction. She was in her car. And even though the footage wasn't clear enough to make everything out, there was no doubt that Reagan wasn't alone. Someone was in the passenger side of the car. And from the looks of it, they were forcing Reagan to withdraw a lot of money from the bank. While the investigators were trying their best to enhance the footage to see who it was that got into her car, they got yet another hit, and it was even more promising. The DNA on the cigarette butts found in Reagan's car had just been matched. They were able to track down one particular man, and he already had a laundry list of felonies. This was 29-year-old Brian Goldsby. He wasn't your typical criminal, though. He'd actually been released from prison just a couple months before Reagan's abduction and murder in November of 2016, and he was listed as a Tier 3 sex offender. Let that sink in. Brian had been living a life of crime since he was a child. But as an adolescent, he took advantage of two kids aged just 5 and 6. This is a crime that I don't even have words for, and I don't think anyone does. Taking advantage of someone is a new level of evil in its own right. But 5 and 6-year-old kids, well, Brian committed many crimes, including criminal trespassing, receiving stolen property, theft, shoplifting, criminal damage. The list goes on and on. He was eventually charged with threatening his own mom. Even from then on, it was crime after crime. And as he got older, his crimes only got darker and more perverse. Brian was eventually sentenced to 6 years in prison for abducting and forcing himself on a pregnant woman, all in front of her 2-year-old son. But he was released somehow in early November of 2016. But Brian was anything but a model prisoner behind bars. During his very short time in prison, he was a menace, committing over 52 infractions, including possessing contraband, refusing to obey orders, stealing, fighting, and creating disturbances. He had to be sent to 5 different prisons throughout 5 and 1-2 years. But somehow he was still allowed to be released after all this. Following his release, Brian was given a GPS tracking device by a re-entry program for ex-offenders called Alvis. But it was as good as useless because Alvis didn't even bother to monitor Brian at all. His own parole officer didn't even keep up with him. He committed 6 more robberies while he was on parole and never even got reprimanded for it. Well, after his release from prison, Brian was living in a temporary housing center which was run by the exit program. But again, they failed to monitor a Tier 3 sex offender. He's basically left free to do whatever he wanted to do. The only condition of the exit program was that Brian had to be in the housing center from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. His parole conditions also included having that GPS device with a full battery at all times. But obviously, Brian thought it was above the law and violated all these conditions, and not one person batted an eye. In fact, when the exit program officials were approached, they said that Brian's actions were deemed non-severe. This dude is a registered sex criminal, robbing people, violating people, breaking the law. How is none of this seen as severe? Well, in the end, a hearing for Brian's 3rd parole violation was scheduled for February 23rd, and get this, he could have returned to prison. But before that day could come, Brian's crimes seriously escalated from robbing and terrorizing people. And now he was wanted for outright murder. So with all this information, the police knew that they had their guy. Brian's GPS monitor showed him near the restaurant where Reagan worked. The monitor placed him at all of the ATMs Reagan had been seen at that night. And he was also seen in the CCTV footage buying the same red gas can that was then found in Reagan's car. If that wasn't enough, DNA on Reagan's body also matched Brian's DNA. Well, 2 days after Reagan's disappearance, the house was surrounded by the investigators and SWAT teams, and he was arrested. Brian was interviewed for hours and initially had denied everything. He said that he didn't know who Reagan was, why she was attacked, and all that stuff. Well, that was when the detectives pulled out the DNA report. If Brian didn't know who Reagan was, then why was his DNA all over Reagan's body as well as inside of her car? That was the moment when Brian changed his story for the first time. And be warned, he does this a lot from this point on. If you remember, Brian's MMO was to abduct or overpower his victims, get into their car, and force them to drive to different ATMs for money. Well, that was exactly what he did with Reagan, too. He admitted to the investigators that he saw Reagan leaving the restaurant, and since the street was dimly lit, he got close to Reagan and overpowered her from behind and forced her into the car. But then Brian pulled out the kicker, his side of the story. He went on to confess that he only planned to rob Reagan. Once he got however much money he wanted, he made Reagan drive to the park where her body was eventually found and ordered her to turn around with her back facing him and to not move. Then Brian allegedly made Abilene for Reagan's car and just drove away. He swore up and down that Reagan was still alive when he left, and had proceeded to abandon the car at Oakwood Avenue and left on foot from there on out. But the police pressed Brian on this hard, and it worked because he changed his story once again. Brian then said that he'd gotten into a sticky mess with a guy named TJ. Allegedly, this TJ ordered Brian to pay up some money that he owed him, or he claimed he would harm Brian's kids. Brian said that it was TJ who proposed the whole scheme of robbing Reagan. And once they were done with the part of the plan and the three Reagan, TJ, and Brian were at the park, TJ ordered Brian to force himself on Reagan. Brian said that he had no choice because TJ claimed he would kill Brian's family. This is interesting because if you remember, he traumatized a young boy by taking advantage of his pregnant mom in front of him. But now he suddenly has a heart and didn't want to lay a hand on Reagan. That seems pretty unlikely. Well, after Brian was finished with Reagan, TJ supposedly pointed the weapon at her and ended her life. Now, the investigators knew that there was no TJ, but they decided to play the long game. They managed to coerce Brian into disclosing where Reagan's clothes and murder weapon were. Brian confessed that he threw the clothes, phone, and shell casings nearby. In the end, the nail in the coffin was a confession in which Brian came clean about everything. But it wasn't to the police. It was to his own girlfriend, who was also the mother of his children. He also came clean to another close friend. Brian confessed to these two people that he was the one who robbed, defiled, and murdered Reagan. The plan all along, it was all him. There was no TJ. He acted all on his own. And the reason, well, he didn't want to go back to prison. He knew that she would go to the police and report him. So he didn't want to take any chances. So rather than just not committing any sort of crimes in the first place, he did so anyway and took care of the only witness afterward. He robbed Reagan and forced her to drive to Scioto Grove Park, where he had his way with her. And all the while, Reagan was begging for her life. Brian confessed that Reagan pleaded with him to spare her life because, quote, she just wanted to live, but he couldn't let her do that because he was afraid of being found out. This man literally stole this young woman's life over $60 and a few minutes of pleasure. After the police found out that Brian had confessed to both his girlfriend and a close friend, he was charged with aggravated kidnapping, robbery, assault, and aggravated murder. He pleaded not guilty to all charges, and the trial for Reagan's murder began almost a year after Brian was arrested on February 23, 2018. But the defense had its own game plan. The defense decided to put a spotlight on Brian's unfortunate childhood. See, in Brian's words, his childhood was allegedly filled with neglect, substance abuse, and physical abuse. He also claimed to the investigators that he was taken advantage of when he was a child. The reason why I say allegedly is that we don't actually know the truth. The police had a hard time believing it too because A, Brian was not the most reliable person in the room. He's lied before about many things, so what's stopping him from making things up? And B, his story kept changing when he was talking to the investigators about his childhood. So, do what you will with that information. But even if we believe that Brian had a tough upbringing, what it did to Reagan and those other victims is still inexcusable. Having a bad childhood doesn't give anyone a free pass to take their anger, resentment, and trauma out on random innocent people on the street. Just like how Brian didn't deserve to be abused in his childhood, if he even was, Reagan and other people didn't deserve what happened to them either. In the closing arguments, the defense stressed that Brian didn't maliciously plan Reagan's murder. He panicked at the last moment and decided to take her life so that she wouldn't report him for what he did to her. Well, in the end, on March 13th, the trial ended, and now it was time for a verdict. After deliberation, the jury came back with their decision. Brian was found guilty on all charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. And he'll live and die behind those prison walls, never to see the free world again. After her passing, Reagan's family started the Reagan Toes Memorial Foundation. It was not only a foundation that awarded scholarships to students in need, but it also conducted self-defense classes and helped spread awareness for street safety among everyone. On May 7th of 2017, Reagan was posthumously awarded her psychology degree from Ohio State University, which her parents and sister accepted on her behalf. Reagan's family had given up a piece of their hearts when they lost Reagan, but they vowed to change the law and protect women in Reagan's community in the future. The Tease family began working with lawmakers to introduce the Reagan Toes Act. In 2018, their efforts finally bore fruit, and the Reagan Toes Act was introduced into the Ohio House and then the Senate, and at the end of 2018, the Reagan Toes Act was signed into law. This act requires judges to sentence offenders of Class 1 and 2 felonies to a variety of years in prison, consisting of a minimum term and a maximum term. People who committed these violent crimes will not be let off as easily as Brian was. The act also requires paroled felons to be monitored very closely and attend regular meetings. What happened to Reagan could have easily been prevented if Brian had simply been monitored by the ex-con programs and his parole officer. But he wasn't, and he was free to do whatever he wanted. After all was said and done, the very place where Reagan's body was found has now been turned into a rock garden memorial. Her family wished to turn the field into a sanctuary so that Reagan could be remembered without any of the painful memories, essentially covering up the terrible reminders of her fateful resting place with a beautiful sanctuary of peace where everyone can come drop their shoulders and relax. Reagan's ex-boyfriend Jake also set up a GoFundMe for her remembrance. It's raised over $95,000, and the money is being dispersed to their college students to help with their tuition in Reagan's honor. Reagan's life was taken away for all the wrong reasons. She was targeted by a bitter excuse of a person who couldn't do anything but make others' lives a complete train wreck. He was a pathetic excuse of a person. He deserves everything he will ever get. I just hope that Reagan's family is doing okay after all this time has passed. What they did after Reagan's untimely passing to amend the law and make things better, it's truly inspirational. But it shouldn't take a tragic loss like this to promote changes in safety laws. Quite honestly, I'm sick of covering cases like this, where a crime was completely preventable. But because of incompetent lawmakers and law enforcement officers, a violent criminal was set free. It should never ever get this far. And this case is a haunting reminder for every single one of us to just be better. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Pamela Rains and Denise Lambert. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos, sometimes days or weeks, before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate all of you guys that have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find a link down in the description. And don't forget the new True Crime Stories. It's Never a Mannequin t-shirt is available now at the link below. Every purchase helps support the channel, and you get a really cool shirt in return. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered, and don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Tokes, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.